Hello, Robert. Welcome to the Any Grief Goes podcast. Thank you for coming on as a guest.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on because today we're going to talk about a grief that perhaps people don't necessarily see as grief. But before we get into that, please do introduce yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, I'm Robert Dodds. I'm a therapist and a couples therapist, singular therapist from therapistinlondon.com. And I also post very short form videos on social media occasionally talking about psychology.
Yeah, and they're brilliant and they're very informative. So I would encourage anybody to look Robert up on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the grief in relation to long-term relationships and when they end. Tell us why.
Yes, it's
Yeah, go ahead. Just tell us whatever you want.
right. There's
That comes to mind.
a slight delay. Yeah. So in my experience, a lot of people don't take this type of grief seriously as grief, and it really is a type of grief. People can get post-traumatic stress disorder from a breakup, a sudden breakup of a long-term relationship. Sort of 7, 8+ years, and for a lot of people, these breakups, or at least one person in a relationship, these breakups seemingly come out of nowhere. And that causes a lot of stress and distress to people in very much the same way that grief affects people for any big loss, a loss of a loved one, a loss of a relationship, especially in, when you're talking about a marriage or an equivalent long-term relationship where you have a couple who spend so much time together and then that part of your life is gone, for better or worse. It's not there anymore, and a lot of the time, a divorce, a breakup, can be liberating. It's certainly seen as a liberating thing in our society. But I think that because it's seen as a liberating thing, the emotional distress side of it is diminished by people and by our society. I don't know. I'm sure we all know people who've been through these types of breakups, a divorce, or a long-term relationship ending. And friends will often say things that are quite unhelpful, maybe a little bit helpful, like, "Oh, I never liked them anyway. You're better off alone. Plenty more fish in the sea. Let's have a makeover. Let's get you on these dating apps, Let's find you someone else." Whereas, and that can be helpful and that can be great. But I think that it also discounts the fact that it's a big trauma someone's just been through. And those traumatic feelings are often diminished or completely ignored by society and by the people who are experiencing them.
Yeah, it definitely falls under the disenfranchised type of grief, doesn't it? Because people don't take it seriously, as you were saying. They think it's just a breakup. But you're right. When you've been with somebody for that long, that's a huge chunk of time. That's a huge chunk of your life, and that's a huge amount of yourself you've given to a relationship. So tell us how people genuinely respond to the grief of the end of a relationship. Is it similar to a bereavement?
It's very similar to a bereavement. People, except it's a bereavement where people feel that they can't openly mourn the loss. It's a bereavement and a grief feeling that they have that they also feel ashamed of. In a lot of cases, a lot of people feel not just ashamed that they've gone through a divorce, because we have this strange stigma in our society about divorces being, the be all and end all, and almost like a tarnish to someone's name, but also feeling bad about the divorce. You get this a lot from people's friends where they might open up to their friends. "Oh, I'm really upset about what happened," and they say, "Oh, forget about it. You're better off without them." And so you wouldn't dream of saying that to someone who's lost their pet or a grandparent. You wouldn't say, get on the dating app and find a new grandparent. you know, you would be given time to grieve, and your friends would be accepting of them. And I think as a society, we need to do more to support people going through these things and to destigmatize it, because there really shouldn't be a stigma.
No, I agree. There shouldn't be a stigma. But it's interesting what you said about the shame. And I'm assuming that you mean the shame from a failure, a perceived failure of not being able to make something work. Or tell us a bit more about what that shame is and how someone can manage it
Yeah.
when you feel it.
Well, that's certainly an element as well. But mostly, a lot of people, they have shame about feeling upset that the relationship has ended. They are ashamed that they're sad about it, because we're taught in our society and by the people around us, this is a great thing. You're finally free. All of this type of messaging we get about divorces, and they can be empowering, certainly. But even in the most empowering divorces, there can still be a huge loss that people aren't able to express because it just gets shut down by their friends or family or just co-workers or anyone around them. A lot of people, when they go through a huge breakup or end of a relationship, in terms of feeling of loss and shame that the relationship didn't work, if it's the person who has been sort of it's come out the blue to them, there's often a case where one person, it's obvious to them the relationship's going to end and they eventually break up with their partner, but their partner will often feel surprised by this, as if they didn't expect it at all. And you see this a lot. This is a very, very common thing people say during a breakup is, I didn't see it coming. I thought everything was fine. Now that's usually because of a number of reasons, communication being a big one, or not being attuned to your partner. And the person in that situation, and this is the situation where people can develop post-traumatic stress disorder when they lose a relationship, seemingly to them suddenly and out of the blue, although to their partner it's been a long time coming. To them, it's out of the blue, and it's sudden, and it's a big trauma all at once. And these people will often stay up at night, wake up at night obsessing over what happened, what could I have done differently. They often have this feeling that because something bad has happened to them, it must be because of something they have done. This is a sort of evolutionary thing we have as humans, where if we get harmed, we look back at our actions and think, okay, what did we do to get harmed? And let's avoid that in the future. And unfortunately, that we apply that to situations where it's not always true. It's not always true that, because a relationship has ended, you must have done something to cause it to end. That's not always the case. In fact, often it's just a mismatch of personalities and poor communication. And, if you're talking about a sort of 7-8 year relationship, as I said earlier, and you have a couple, you look through, what did I do wrong for this relationship to end? Well, you've got 8 years of everyday experiences to look through, and that's really impossible. It's an impossible task. So that's a really difficult one, and I think a lot of people need to be reassured that it probably wasn't something they did. Could just be that they're just not compatible, or two people fell out of love, and it just wasn't communicated well. So, people feel ashamed as well about that, about the fact that a relationship has ended.
That kind of blame, and the self-blame and the guilt, that is quite a common theme in grief. So how do you support somebody to truly believe that it wouldn't, it wouldn't necessarily be their fault? Sometimes it is just the compatibility issue. If they're suffering the PTSD, is that hard to penetrate, that kind of thoughts
Well,
processes?
it would depend on the person. For some people, if they come into therapy having just experienced a breakup and they're in a state of emotional turmoil, the priority would be bringing them back to a state of regulated emotions where they can sort of then start to function day to day, get past the depression. But it's important to sort of then actually go back through, if they're having this sort of thought process of, what have I done? What did I do it's important to walk through it with them. It can be for some people, a lot of people, to walk through the relationship with them and think, well, what did you do? What did happen? What was your part in the breakup? Was it passivity, a lack of noticing, or was it really completely not your fault? So, there could be an element of blame. There often is an element of blame, even if it's 5 or 10%. But to sort of work out what that is and how to then adjust to behaviors in the future to avoid that happening again. For example, someone who's not attentive to their partner's needs. For example, you might get a partner where one person in the relationship is a very, very messy person and it doesn't bother them, and then the other person is a very tidy and clean person. That can cause a lot of conflict. And I think in that situation, the conflict would be worse for the person who's very tidy, because the person who's messy might not necessarily see it as a big deal. That something's a bit messy. Okay, it's not tidy, no big deal. In those situations, it can be very difficult for relationships to move forward without really putting a conscious effort for both parties. The messy person to make a conscious effort to be more tidy, and for the tidier person to make a conscious effort to, if they really want the relationship to work, to sort of lower their standards on tidiness a little bit, because a little bit of mess and clutter in a house isn't the worst thing in the world. If it's not dirty, if everything's clean, it's just disorganized, a tiny bit of that's not the worst thing in the world. And that's an example where the messy person might be considered entirely to blame for a relationship breaking up, right? Because they're messy, the other person's tidy, they haven't adjusted. But also the tidy person hasn't adjusted their standards, or maybe they haven't adjusted them much, because both parties feel that they're right in their worldview, and both parties are right in their worldview for their own personal comfort levels. But coexisting is a different thing altogether.
Yeah, and I was wondering what the link is. Is there a link between how people have seen other relationships break up and they've seen other people in their lives or from their childhood respond and grieve to different relationships? Is there a link that then affects how they also respond?
Absolutely. Certainly, if you experience this in early childhood, sort of before 6 or 7 years old, sort of between 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, these are very, very formative years, and you are looking to your parents, your caregivers, older siblings, the world around you for an instruction manual on how to live and how to be and how to exist. And if you see a particularly messy divorce, for example, your parents divorce at that age and it's particularly messy and difficult, that can not only affect how you process grief of breakups of your own in the future, but also any losses. But when it comes to sort of these big childhood moments, they can really have bigger effects than that. It can not just extend beyond how they deal with grief, because that's how it's been modeled to them, and how our society models grief as well. We have this idea in our society, and I'm sure you disagree with this as much as I do, that grief is something that happens to us. We're not a part of it. It happens to us, and it happens for a couple of months or a couple of weeks, and then it's over. This is our societal idea of grief, and this is how it's portrayed in media, books, movies, video games. It's something that happens to people. That's not really the reality. The reality is that we are part of that experience, and it doesn't just last months. In some cases, it can just last months, but a lot of the time it lasts for years or perhaps an entire lifetime. So certainly the way we see grief in relationships, relationship breakdowns modeled to us, really does have an impact on how we ourselves react, especially if that's modeled to us at a early age where we're more impressionable. As adults, we have to sort of unlearn all of the things we learned wrong in our early years.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I think we spend that there's there's that idea, isn't there, that we spend the first half of our life trying to kind of fit in, and then the second half of our life trying to just actually, let's be more authentic and figure out what happened to us and how we can respond to that and live differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the case of a child whose parents are having a divorce, this can lead to, if the parents aren't very, very careful with how they process their own divorce, this can lead to lifelong issues for the child. Not just perhaps as much as a personality disorder, if it's a particularly difficult divorce, but it also could lead to just sort of proto personality disorder symptoms. Personality disorders are usually a list of symptoms that someone has, and once they've reached a certain amount of symptoms all ticked off, then they're diagnosable with that personality disorder. If they're one shy of the cutoff, they don't have the personality disorder, but they're certainly still suffering. They're just suffering without a label from the DSM. And these mechanisms that people learn as children for the response of trauma can impact us not just in dealing with grief, but in dealing with everyday interactions, in dealing with our own emotions. So it's really important that people who are going through a divorce and have children really put a lot of work into dealing with their own grief, dealing with their own trauma from the divorce, and not letting it impact their parenting or minimizing how much it impacts their parenting. Because a divorce from a set of parents can genuinely lead to issues for the child for 80 years.
That is a really fascinating point. So what you're saying is that a child, through seeing a divorce of a parents, could grow up and develop certain mental health diagnoses stemming from grief, stemming from grieving somebody else's relationship and grieving a family unit.
Yes. Or, as well as that, they can grow up with these issues, these symptoms, and these struggles because they have a parent that's grieving a loss, and through their own consumption in their grief, they are unable to effectively parent and be emotionally attuned to the child.
So this is a big topic then. So there's two separate parts to that, isn't it? I'm really interested in the child's experience, actually. How would a grieving adult be able to minimize the impact of their grief, their stuff, onto a child?
Well, if it's available to them, they should go to therapy, which is very difficult here in the UK. As you know, you can get therapy on the NHS, but it's often short-term CBT, which isn't. I mean, short-term CBT, 6 to 12-week session of CBT can be helpful for processing a breakup. It's a great system, CBT. I think it's overprescribed on the NHS, and I think that people going through a divorce are probably better off with talk therapy, some sort of psychotherapy, or an attachment-based, therapist who deals in attachment-based theories. Now, I'm not just saying that because I'm a therapist who deals in attachment-based theories. That's my opinion, because it's a family system, it's a family unit that's broken apart, and in dealing with your own emotions, it would allow you to be more emotionally attuned to your children. Now, the children are going through a big loss of their own if the parents are splitting up, because one of the parents is leaving the house. Suddenly, instead of having two parents there 7 days a week, they might have one parent. They might be with one parent 5 days and another parent 2 days, or is more common in the UK, is that you'll have the children be with the mother for 7 days a week, and then with the father for 4 days a month, every other weekend. That's a huge loss for the child. And I think that one way to minimize that is for the child to spend more time, if it's possible, to spend time with both the parents, maybe go to the park together. That can be very difficult. I understand that can be very difficult if you're going for a messy divorce, and divorces are designed by our legal system to be very adversarial. So people end up really really hating each other by the end of it. They might go into a divorce planning for it to be amicable and come out hating each other. Just because of the way our legal system's set up, it's not a great system for families. It's a good system for sort of business disputes, Starbucks suing someone for using their logo. That's a great system for that. But for a family, not so much, because it's adversarial. So if it's possible to minimize the impact on the child, is to make sure that they don't just lose one parent, because that's a huge loss. A lot of people are resenting their partners during a divorce, and they might not take that seriously. They might think, well, for example, if it's a mother, they might think, well, he's an awful father. He's horrible to me. The child's better off without him. The child who's 5, 6 years old won't be thinking that. The child will be thinking, I've just lost someone. I've lost an attachment figure. Therefore, I can lose people whenever. Out of the blue, people can be lost. And that child can have post-traumatic stress symptoms from the parents splitting up. So it's important, if possible, and it's hard, to spend time together as a family unit, even if you're not a family unit anymore. And you make sure the child understands you're not, mummy and daddy aren't together anymore. But you're still going to be a family. You're still both the parents. You still both love them. You'll hang out together, if possible. Not always possible. I understand that. A lot of the time it's not possible, but that's it in an ideal world. And also, the parents individually are both in therapy, dealing with their own emotions, their own grief, so that they can be emotionally attuned to their child and be aware of the child's emotions and mirror them back to them. Because this is a lot of the issue, is when you have a parent who's depressed or going through grief, which is terrible, they become sort of partially numb to the world, and they don't notice all of their child's emotions and what's going on for their children. This can happen for a number of reasons, not just grief. This can happen from addiction problems, mental health problems from the parents. But in this case, in the case of grief, if they're not attuned to their child, emotionally attuned to their child, the child's sort of flailing internally and the parents not noticing, and that can cause really some terrible issues. I mean, almost all personality disorders, and I believe there are 12 personality disorders in the DSM, almost all of them can be traced back to childhood emotional neglect and a lack of attunement from the parents. So really, if you're a parent going through a divorce, your absolute top priority shouldn't be, let's get as much money from this as possible, let's smear the other person. The priority should be, let's try and regulate my emotions, at least around my child, and make sure the child comes out of this unscathed or with the effects as minimized as possible, because that's the person who's going to be carrying the weight of the breakup for the longest time.
Okay, my mind is going in two different places here. So I wonder if we could just, before we leave, address those two things.
Sure.
The first thing I'm thinking is a lot of people don't divorce because of the child. But does that mean that adults are grieving more what they don't have within a relationship, and then it impacts the child? And then the second thing is addressing the secondary losses for a child, because they've not just lost a figure in the house, they've lost perhaps routine or financial stability or a number of different things. So I don't know, can you speak on those two things?
Well, the first case, almost no one divorces because of a child. But the impact of...
No, they don't. I meant they don't divorce because they're trying to protect. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that in itself, people who are staying together for the children, you hear this a lot, people stay together for the children. That can be more damaging than a divorce. If the relationship is not worked on, and those people should go to couples counseling if they can, if it's available to them. There's lots of charities where they can do that. Relate, I believe, does free couples counseling or low-cost couples counseling. There's lots of places where people can get affordable or free couples counseling. In those situations, it can have all of the same impacts. A child might be neglected because the parents, although they're still in the same house together, they're both very unhappy. Because they're unhappy, they're out of touch with the child's emotions and they're not attuned to the child. or they see arguing. And seeing your parents arguing is really damaging for children at any age, all the way up to sort of as an adult. If an adult sees their parents having a big screaming argument, that can be really distressing for them. Even in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Now, for a 5 or 6-year-old, that's one of the most distressing things in the world. So that staying together for the children, while it can be a good thing, it can be good that people stay together and the family unit remains intact, which I would say should always be a priority, although not over your own happiness. But once you have children involved, the children really I think should be the focus on sort of making yourself the best parent you can be. Again, not at the extent, not if it's going to cost you your own happiness, because a very unhappy parent is not going to be a good parent. So that can be just as damaging as a divorce, if not more damaging. I mean, I know people who have grown up with terrible households because the parents stayed together for the kids. And I think in the cases that I'm thinking of, a lot of those people would have been better off if the parents had broken up sooner. And because they would have had less trauma of seeing the parents arguing, less trauma of hearing the parents arguing, less trauma of having two depressed parents. I mean, this idea of a child, and children are very aware of their parents' emotions. If you're depressed, your child knows about it. So if you have two parents who are deeply unhappy, the child will often blame themselves, even if they logically know it's not their fault. Children are very egocentric in that they believe the world is all about them because their world is all about them. But they have a hard time conceptualizing that things happen that it's nothing to do with them at all. So children will blame themselves for arguments as much as they blame themselves for divorce. So it's very, very tricky situation and time when a relationship's breaking down between a husband and wife, or two husbands or two wives, or whatever. When there's children involved, it's very, very tricky. And what was your second point again? Sorry.
The second point was just going back to, it's not just a parent figure that's leaving the house. It's still the secondary losses. So perhaps a loss of routine or changing routines, or perhaps the financial situation in the household will change once one person has left the house. So there's lots of different loss within that one grief event.
Yeah, and for a child, that can be very difficult. It's very difficult on the parents, the people who are going through the breakup, to lose everything. A lot of the time you'll lose. They might lose. The child might lose their home. Maybe the house they grew up in, or at least the one they currently live in. They might have to downsize. They'll have less money, less access to things, because suddenly it's just one income instead of two. It's a huge time of unrest for a child, and this period of unrest could last for years. It could be years of unraveling finances and divorce proceedings. One parent's disappeared, they now only see them a couple of times a month. If in most cases it's 4 days a month in the UK for a child to see their father, which I don't think is enough, but that's the rules we have. You could always, by the way, if you're going through a divorce now and you're worried about your children not seeing their father enough, 4 days a month is the minimum. You can have your child see the father as much as you want, above 4 days a month. 4 days a month, I believe, is the court ordered minimum in most cases, which is every other weekend. But I think more is better.
Yeah.
And if you can do it together, it's better as well. The 3 of you or 4 of you, however many children there are, it could be 3 or 4 children. I grew up in a house with 4 children, so there were a lot of us. So it could be 4 children and 2 adults. That would be quite a difficult day at the park, I imagine, to manage that. But the children in a divorce will lose, like you said, a lot more than just a parent. The routine changes. The remaining parent who they're living with most of the time, their personality will change as well, because they will be having depression, stress. They might be angry. They might decide to go dating straight away. And they might make the mistake of introducing their children to new partners too soon, and then those partners can up and leave. And that's something I don't recommend, by the way. If you have young children and you're dating, don't introduce them to your partners until you're sure those partners are going to stick around for a long time, because you don't want to teach a child that people come into their lives and then disappear, and come into their lives and then disappear, because they're going to have attachment injuries from that could impact the way they see their own relationships in the future. They might grow up thinking, in a relationship, a romantic relationship, they might grow up thinking, oh, this person's going to disappear out of the blue. This has been modeled to me my whole life. People coming and then disappearing, coming and then disappearing. So if you do have children you're dating, don't introduce them to the kids until you're certain it's going to be a long-term thing. Or introduce them as a buddy, a friend. Oh, this is my friend. Don't introduce them as a partner. That's a mistake. Even if you're really into them, certainly not until maybe 6 months or a year in. Then then you can do it, I would say, as a rule of thumb.
That's helpful advice. And we have come to the end of our time here, which is a shame, because I think I could talk to you for much, much longer. But leave us with the top tips you could give to somebody who is grieving the breakup of a relationship.
My number one tip is talk to your therapist. YouTube podcasts are not a substitute for therapy. Although they're very helpful, they can be very helpful. I've used them myself to get through difficult times as a supplement to therapy. There are lots of places you can get free therapy if it's not available to you for financial reasons. But yeah, if you don't have a therapist, get a therapist. If you have children, really work hard to make sure that it impacts the children as little as possible. And try not to blame yourself, because it probably wasn't anything you did. It probably was just the natural conclusion of the relationship. Maybe you weren't compatible. If you're waking up at night thinking, what happened? What did I do? Why did she leave? Why did he leave? It's probably not your fault. And obsessing over it won't help you come to that answer. You won't find out unless they tell you, which is, I wouldn't count on happening.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to link to all your contact details in the notes of the show. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.